Welcome back to How to Be a Better DM, the official podcast of Monsters.rent. I'm Justin Lewis.
And I'm Tanner Wayland.
And we are here to help you tell better stories for yourself and your players as you dungeon master sessions of D&D, Dungeons & Dragons. We'd like to give you some quick announcements. We actually have one before the show, and then after the show, if you want to stick around, we have some more announcements then as well. But first, let's talk about this. Tired of being alone? Are you tired of not having any of your players understand you? Are you tired of never truly belonging? Well, you're in luck. All you need to do is join the Guild. The Guild is a unique and exclusive experience that is only open to Dungeon Masters. It is a full community focused on helping ease your DMing burdens. Want to meet other DMs? Join the Guild. Want to discuss your homebrew ideas with people who would appreciate it instead of just telling your cat? Join the Guild. Want to find a place where all your wildest dreams will come true? Join the Guild. Go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free. Wait, that can't be right. Chuck, can you check this again? Is this supposed to be... What? Oh, they're serious? It's free? Oh, okay. All right. Yes, go to monsters.rent/guild and sign up today for free, even though they are crazy for giving this away for free. Common side effects may include burping, sneezing, laughing, breathing, hearing, listening, tasting, farting, critting, sarcasm, and in extreme cases, explosive diarrhea. Awesome. With that out of the way, we can get into today's show.
Hello, and welcome to How to Be a Better DM, the official podcast of Monsters.rent. My name is Tanner Wayland, and today we're going to learn about how to provide the best adventures and storytelling for our D&D parties. So honestly, I'm very excited about the topic today because it's kind of controversial nowadays, especially when it used to be used quite often. And I'm talking about random encounters, specifically random combats. Now, for anyone who maybe is unfamiliar with this, let me explain. Typically in a large campaign or one that's very exploratory or in a world setting, right, there's a system called random encounters. Now, random encounters in general is like, hey, you are going through the world. Let's say that you're traveling, across a map and they pass through a certain area like a desert or a swamp. Maybe it's a hex-based exploration style, right? Whatever it is, they're passing along, and you have, as the DM, a correlating table of random encounters. And so as they're passing through, it's like, okay, in this, you spend 3 hours walking, you cover this many miles, or, kilometers, and, let me just, as the DM, roll a quick roll. Okay, nothing happened. Or you get to another space and it's like, oh, so you're walking down the street, or not the street in this case. Let's say the desert. So you crest over a sand dune, and below you notice there's some lumps in the sand. You don't think anything of it, and then out pop some bandits. Right? That's an example of a random encounter where, you rolled on the table of encounters of different combats, and 3 hidden bandits, or just bandits, and you added flavor that they were hidden. Whatever it is, the table essentially does the decision making for you. It kind of allows you to prepare a lot of encounters ahead, or a lot of people like to buy big old campaign settings of an entire world from their favorite podcast, from a different world within D&D, or a campaign setting, right? Whatever it is, they will often have these random tables, and it just kind of takes some of that decision making out of your hands. Now, you're probably familiar with this if you've ever played video games, or specific ones. I should clarify. Like Pokemon or Final Fantasy, they are big fans of random encounters. Where your character's walking through the tall grass, or a forest, or a cave, and suddenly, a Zubat or a Pikachu attacks them, right? or in Final Fantasy, it could be anything, right? The point is that it's a way to randomize the experience. Now, I was saying at the start that it's kind of a, how do I say, like, unpopular system nowadays. And there's a few reasons for that. Because as much as, yes, the goal is that it saves, a DM's time, that, hey, they were able to prepare everything really early and then put it in a table and then you roll and then, they don't have to worry about doing it session by session because they bulk prepared at the start. And then once the session comes up, they roll it. They see, oh, okay, this time we're fighting a couple owl bears. Let me pull up that page, for that encounter. It's all prepared, right? That's nice, especially if you're a perfectionist like me. It's a nice way to kind of relinquish control and be a little bit more, play a little bit more off the cuff. But on the other hand, a lot of people feel like, hey, I like my, it's not like we have all the time in the world to play D&D. We kind of want to get to a point. And if we have something in the game, we prefer it was really fun or really well, written or an important plot point that kind of moves it along. And that's kind of the difference between a video game. Well, actually, no. I was going to say that that's the difference between a video game and D&D is that D&D, we want it to be a little bit more purposeful because we have to coordinate schedules and the DM has to plan everything, right? But honestly, video games have the same issue. Like a lot of times when a huge game is being made, like a big world game, open world game, some video game developers will pad the content by adding random encounters. Essentially, it's like, hey, we don't have the time to make a bunch of hand-tailored, very specific encounters. So instead, let's just, kind of do a spinning wheel that, a random like system that just essentially lengthens the game with a bunch of filler content, right? A bunch of fluff. And, initially people really liked that in video games, but then they found like, hey, this isn't authored nearly as much. This isn't quite what I was looking for. And I find that DMs, that's also the worry there, especially because you're worried that like, oh, I have a hard enough time making a normal combat that I plan, just session to session. I have a hard time making that feel really engaging to players because it can kind of, depending on your play style, some combats, they just go on too long, right? And a lot of combats, it's like, oh, you're traveling through the tunnel to the interesting event. But then in the tunnel, they run into a gelatinous cube and that's cool. But, some people don't like slowing down the path of the players with anything that isn't like, oh, you're fighting, a really cool NPC who has a whole backstory, right? Or you're fighting an iconic, beholder or something, right? Some people don't want filler at all. Even though we all know that that's kind of difficult to do as a DM, I think that many people want to avoid having filler because they'd like high quality adventures and stories. But I don't think that means that random encounters need to be completely dismissed, right? I think that there's a way to implement them and also specific times to implement them. Specifically, when you're trying to make a world feel fleshed out, I think that random encounters are perfect for that, right? Where you're like, hey, I don't roll them every second, but it's been a sec and I know that they're about to enter a city and they're going to be talking with a lot of NPCs and it might not be a combat for a little bit. Okay, let's roll on the random chart. Oh, they're outside of the city, still a few, a few leagues away, and then they run into, some bandits or into a pack of dire wolves or whatever you want to say, right? That's a nice way to kind of mix it up and be like, and tell about the world through the different types of encounters, right? And you can even add into, don't give up on flavor, right? Don't give up on storytelling, even though the encounter wasn't initially planned to be, that specific encounter. You can totally see, like, roll that dice on the random encounter chart you can see like, oh, okay, so we have some fey creatures that are going to be attacking the party. We're trying to bamboozle them and then attack them. There's a couple ways that you could do it. You could just be like, you round the bend and oh my goodness, you see, these flying creatures and they attack you. Roll initiative. That's an option, and it's not, I'm sure the players would still enjoy the combat, but you can throw in some storytelling. You're a storyteller. You can do it. You can be like, okay, I've rolled this. The players are kind of talking. Let me pull up the stats. Great. Got the stats. How am I going to introduce this? Take like a 10-second breather, or you have everyone take a small break and be like, okay, everyone grab a drink. I'm just preparing some stuff. And then, just real quick, think about how to introduce them. And like, okay, maybe the fey creatures are actually posing as beggars on the side of the street. And then, they get a surprise attack on the players, unless the players are cunning enough to notice, or they roll an insight or a perception check, right? And that's kind of where you can add some oomph to it all, is doing that little bit of extra in the moment preparation on top of all of the mechanical preparation you did when you got the random encounter chart in the first place or created it. So that's a way that you can really, make a random encounter feel like a planned encounter. So I would highly recommend that. And what's also fun about random encounters? It keeps the mystery and the surprise alive for you, because now you're not as worried like, hey, oh man, okay, I hope that it goes off as well as I hoped this combat would. No, you are being surprised as much as the players, and that's awesome. It kind of adds a little bit of that initial fun that sometimes DMs lose after we've been in the DM seat for so long, because we know everything that's going to happen except for the player's response. Now you also get surprised by your own story, right? But then you can still tell a great story with that by adding some extra little things. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that I mentioned earlier that like, hey, combat can drag. And so that's one big reason why people don't want to do a random encounter, is that they're like, hey, my normal combat's already drag. Why on earth would I want to add more combats that aren't story meaningful or that aren't planned with some really fun mechanics or traps or anything, right? My answer is that you really need to think about your combats. One, we've said this a billion times. If your combats in general are sluggish, time turns. Get people on base and be like, hey, you're doing next. I need to know what you're doing within a minute. And then also do the same for yourself. Have like strategies written out beforehand for what your monsters or the villains are going to act, right? Do that, and that'll make combat a lot more snappy. But on top of that, if it's a random encounter, even more than a normal encounter, I would suggest that you look for telltale signs that, the players have been fighting long enough, and that you can kind of kill the monster with the next hit. Be very willing to do that with random encounters. Also, you might even want to randomize some other aspects, right? I think that you could have a lot of fun by having multiple tables where you're like, okay, roll first dice. This is the, creature and the number of creatures. And then, a third die, which is like setting or combat trait, where you wrote out a few different like effects. It's like, for this situation, the sun is like really hot, and that causes like a physical effect where the players have to do a Constitution saving throw or something like that, right? There's ways that you can randomize even more than just the enemies themselves, and I think you should play around with it. It'll make the combats more interesting. It'll avoid some of that rote combat that you might be worried about with a random encounter, and I think that that's just going to be best for you overall. Now, I've been kind of talking up random encounters in general, I don't think it's perfect for everywhere, right? I've mentioned that, in a journey, in a world setting, it's great. But if you're in a town, honestly, you don't want to be rolling a bunch of things in the town because a town is already, they're going to be talking with a lot of NPCs. Those NPCs should have stories or quests that, lead to combat that has a more goal-based purpose, right? Um, so I would say, like, in a town, you don't need to be rolling these things. Even like in a dungeon, no, dungeons are a great place where you should be having planned encounters, planned traps. You go into a room, that room should be iconic and have everything kind of planned to a deeper level. But, when you're just out in the world, that's a solid time to do it. Now, it's not a solid time to do it if your players just had a bunch of combats in a dungeon because it was a combat heavy dungeon. At that point, you know what? Maybe you just hand wave the journey and, they get to the largest seaport relatively easy, right? And then they have a bunch of role playing there. And then once they embark on the sea, then you break out your random encounter chart for the sea. But you don't do it, when you've already had a combat heavy, session or portion of your campaign. So you got to kind of play it by ear there. Now, I mentioned goals in terms of like, hey, in a city, NPCs will give more goal-based reasons to have combats. That's not me saying that random encounters can't interact with goals in an interesting way, right? Now, let's take the desert example, right? Where it's one thing to be like, oh, you're going from town A to town B through a desert, and oh man, you keep running into different enemies along the way. That's something. It's not nothing, but that's very different from having short-term goals within the desert that the players are going to and forth from, and then fighting these encounters. Just to explain myself a little bit, I mean that if a player is trying to get from point A to point B, because at point B, a dungeon, let's say, it has, the amulet that will save the little girl in the town that they came from. If you're doing that and you run into enemies along the way, even though it's a slight tweak in the way that you're not just traveling, but you're traveling for a distinct immediate purpose, then any combat that you have along the way, any random encounter, is going to feel a lot more meaningful. And you might be thinking like, well, yeah, but how meaningful? If you set it up right, if you set up the emotional and, the specific goals, and you teach the party what they need to be going for, then it's going to add some more motivation than you understand. Especially because it's not very motivating just wandering, right? If your party is in the stage where they're just wandering from place to place, then maybe you don't do random encounters until they've been to a place that gives them a sense of purpose, like a quest. The quest giver has been like, hey, I need, these 3 tablets from these 3 separate locations in order for me to put them together and repeat this ancient spell, right? That's going, they'll still travel either way, whether or not they had that quest. But any combats along the way is going to feel a lot more, like a stumbling block to get over versus just a slog. So keep that in mind that, hey, if you're worried about random encounters, make sure that your players have a distinct goals first, because that will mitigate that worry as well. Now, I think the key to random encounters in general is also just don't drop any of your good storytelling habits. You should still, similar to when your party enters a new setting and you have a prepared paragraph, it might be worth it to, take a break, a breather for like 2 minutes for the players, and let them stretch. And then after you've rolled that random encounter table, to, just write out like 2 or 3 sentences that will help you introduce the combat and add, help the players visualize it, more than just, a couple blips on a map that have different stats that they need to get down to 0 so that they beat them, right? You don't want that. Honestly, I hope I haven't overcomplicated it, because the point of a random encounter chart is it's supposed to save you time. And especially, if you're not great at it at the start and you're like, oh, random encounter, and you just throw it at them and you don't add, your own storytelling twist, and there is no goal or whatever it is, if you didn't listen to anything I said, just know that you can practice and get better if that's something you're interested in. And honestly, I think it's something we could all try at least a few times. If we are uncomfortable with it and you like to have a lot more control, that's cool with me. That's where I'm at, right? But on the other hand, I think we could all practice a little bit more, being a little bit more impromptu and releasing some of our control and giving ourselves a chance to try on the fly to create a story in a more real way than you do when you already know what's going to happen ahead of time. So I would encourage you to try it. I think it can be a really freeing experiment, and you might find that you like it, or you might find that you learn some things that you can apply to your normal planned combats. So I would honestly invite you to try it when you find yourself in a portion of your adventure or your campaign that fits that style of combat. And let us know how it goes, right? We love hearing what happens when you guys follow our advice and whether it helped or whether it kind of threw things off balance. Either way, we love those emails. But until next time, let's roll initiative.
Thank you for listening to today's show. We really appreciate your support and your patronage. We have a few more announcements to go over. First,
did you ever fall in love with the library as a kid? It was a place where you could experience 1,000 stories without having to buy 1,000 books. That is what Monsters.rent can do for your D&D campaign. You can rent and swap out as many quality miniature monsters and creatures for your D&D party as you could ever want, without having to buy them. You can rescue villagers from a kobold camp, or lead your party through the fighting forest, or many more adventures. We're coming out with new bundles all the time. Just sign up for our subscription to get access to your own personal library of minis. Go to monsters.rent to find out more. That's the website. Monsters, with an S, .rent. Get your library pass to a world of minis today.
we also wanted to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by Stardust and Dragons. I'm going to let one of the cast of Stardust and Dragons, Christian Hatcher, and his crew tell you a little bit more about it.
This August, a new adventure podcast is coming to a platform near you, filled with action.
You one of the two of them. We can't keep taking hits like that.
Drama.
Everything that she's been doing, everything she's going to do, finally sets in.
And Stardust.
Help! Help! Someone, please!
Find out more about this epic odyssey at stardustanddragons.com, where adventure awaits in the stars.
That's all the announcements we have today. Again, thank you so much for everything you do for us. You make this show possible. Like we said before, we'll be back next week with another great episode, and until then, let's go ahead and roll initiative.